I loved almost everything I saw in Snezhnaya's Transcendence trailer, but even as I fell for the new character designs, I already understood why a lot of people were going to be disappointed. It would be easy to dismiss that disappointment, as some people will always complain, but despite being firmly on the "I love this" side of the equation, in this case I think they have a valid point. It's not about any one character, or even an entire nation, and I don't think it's fair to dismiss it as people who just don't like the game anymore. There's something deeper going on, a set of expectations built up on a subconscious level over the course of several years. Once you start to look at the decisions and directions Hoyo took, both sides of the argument begin to make more sense. Central to this discussion is the concept of a design language. I talked about this in more detail in a similar video last year. I'll give a brief overview here, but if you want a more in-depth look, go check that one out as well. A design language is a system of visual elements and guidelines which are used to create a consistent and cohesive experience. Genshin has a clear character design language which makes the characters feel like they belong in the same world on an instinctive level, even when they embody different cultures. There have always been characters who break the expectations, but for most of the game's history, they served as a contrast which highlighted the cohesiveness of the rest of the cast. I'm personally more aware of this than most people because I studied design and fashion at college and spent years making clothes and hairstyles as a Sims 4 content creator. For most people, it's a subconscious feeling instead. There are many details which are quintessential Genshin. Clothing construction itself is the most obvious. Layers of overlapping fabric, detached sleeves, multi-layered capes, long dangling strips all over the place. Ornamentation is common. Tassels, metallic embellishments, personal objects, printed fabric, hair clips, hats, and so on. And there's a very strong trend of balanced asymmetry, where the different elements of an outfit are asymmetrical but arranged in a way which gives an impression of balance overall. It's important to emphasize, assessing whether a character's design fits the design language you expect does not speak to whether or not their design is good or bad, or whether or not you like it in the end. There are characters who fit the design language perfectly, whose design I cannot stand, and there are others who don't fit, whose design I love. With that point in mind, there's something I've come to realize might be worth saying before any discussion like this. It is actually possible for most people to hold two contradictory ideas or opinions in your head at the same time. I suspect that a lot of the weirder arguments you see online happen because there are people out there who can't do this, or at least haven't ever tried. It's almost like they see the world in black and white, while the rest of us are out here discussing color theory. For example, I prefer character designs which match the game's design language because it makes the world feel more cohesive to me. Natlan's characters, in my opinion, broke from that tradition and instead felt like a deliberate departure from our expectations. Those who cannot comprehend nuance will hear that and start yelling "Natlan hater" and try to act as if everything I'd have to say about that region is tainted with an unfair bias against what Hoyo were trying to achieve. Back to the real world, I like the designs of several characters who are amongst the worst offenders on that point. I like Chaska's design, in spite of her weird clothing and her goofy gun. I like Oraron's, even though he'd be a better fit in a new look catalogue. I even like Raressa's, even though she's almost the most out of place to me. I can like their design and character individually, while still acknowledging that the way they break Genshin's conventions is not something I enjoy. Personally, I find it interesting to talk about these internal contradictions, to try to figure out where my own personal biases come from and why I feel the way I do. I'd never tell anyone else the way they feel is wrong or the way I feel is right, because it's all subjective. Instead, those differences are fascinating to understand, so I like to share my perspective on these things. It's so much fun when people in the comments explain how their experience was different, so I can see through someone else's eyes and maybe end up with a greater appreciation for the art in the end. That is where this kind of video comes from. Anyway, back to the actual point. The first 5 nations each had their own different take on the same themes. They brought together distinct cultural influences and expressed them within a structure of the game's overarching design language. Natlan broke from this tradition, then Not Cry was another outlier in its own way. I'd argue that both regions contributed to people's justifiably mixed perception of Snezhnaya's trailer. While there are a few Natlan characters who do fit the wider trends, most of the cast from that region felt like a series of experiments, an attempt to break the mold and try something different. Love it or hate it, it was undeniably a bold choice, a risk they haven't repeated elsewhere. Not Cry, meanwhile, ended up a different departure from the norm. While there were the usual couple of exceptions, for the most part the character designs aligned much more with the design language. However, even though the characters fit the game's aesthetic, Not Cry as a region didn't have a cohesive visual identity of its own. Many had a design which pointed back to one of the other regions in the game, and even the Not Cry natives were more eclectic than usual due to their myriad factions. Where all the other nations aimed to feel cohesive with perhaps one or two distinctive groups within their borders, Not Cry had as much variety as Natlan in its own way. The Snezhnaya characters we've seen so far are a return to the original formula. They all fit that design language established in the earlier regions, and the level of cohesion within their nation is also back to what we saw in earlier years. People have very different perspectives on these designs, and as always, there's heated debate about who is right and who is wrong, which of course exists in part because people are all talking about different things and not listening to each other. There are a few major threads of discussion which I found most relevant, plus several objections or concerns outside of those, and all of them are at the very least interesting to explore. Those major threads? First, is Snezhnaya bland? Second, does it have its own identity, or is it too similar to Fontaine? And third, is each character's design executed well? There's also a fourth, which always gets inserted into them from outside the community entirely, and then we'll touch on some related tangents once we're done. The first question is all about contrast, and it's where I think the divergent approaches of Natlan and Not Cry shape the discussion. For many people, especially those who had grown a little tired of Genshin's usual formula, Natlan was a welcome change. For others, that region's vibrant experimentation was the reason they got into the game in the first place, or at least the reason they returned. But at the same time, there were, of course, many who still loved the original direction, who ended up split between those who warmed up to the region in the end and those who never did. By the end of Natlan, the fanbase was split between people who enjoyed the vibrant new direction, which gave them greater variety than the game had aimed to reach before, and those who craved a return to the original approach which had hooked them in the first place. I was in the still prefer the original direction camp for whom the change felt out of place, which is the perspective I was trying to explore in that previous video. I liked many of the characters for their own sake, and I did enjoy the variety on some level, but was not a fan of Natlan character design direction overall. With this in mind, Not Cry perhaps turned out to be a better choice than it may have seemed at first glance. It returned to the more cohesive design language which that second group craved, but it gave us a melting pot which maintained the level of variety which Natlan had introduced. Natlan fans could correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but I'm pretty sure this variety may have softened the blow for many of them at least a little. I'd argue that the question of whether Snezhnaya feels bland or not grows from its contrast to these two nations. If it had come out after Inazuma or Sumeru, it would have been a perfect fit for our expectations, and I doubt the lack of variety would have been a point of discussion at all. Instead, it comes after 2 full years in which we got much more variety than we did before. For many, that has become the new baseline expectation. In contrast, the Snezhnaya designs feel too safe, too constrained. I personally don't feel that way and quite enjoy how cohesive they all feel since it exemplifies a sense of place, but I still think the other side's dissatisfaction comes from a reasonable perspective. They met my expectations and hit the notes I was hoping they'd aim for, but Hoyo have to take the blame for setting different expectations for wide swathes of the community and failing to give those people what they felt was promised. The second discussion thread points to stylistic similarities between Snezhnaya and Fontaine. The argument here is that the aesthetics of these two nations are too close to one another, and many of the Snezhnayan characters, if not all of them, would have felt just as fitting in Fontaine as well. For example, while there are some design details which are emphasized more in one nation rather than the other, ruffles and frills are everywhere in Fontaine, while fur trim is much more present in Snezhnaya, those details are still present in the other nation. There's some fur trim in Fontaine, and I spotted some ruffles in Snezhnaya too. Compared to previous iterations, this does stand out. If you think through each nation we've journeyed through, Mondstadt, Liyue, Inazuma, Sumeru, Fontaine, then Natlan, each had a very distinct visual vocabulary compared to every other, and even though the game's design language kept them generally cohesive, there was rarely any doubt which nation any given character came from. In large part, that's because the real-world cultures and eras each nation drew upon were so visually distinct, and that is where this issue comes from in my opinion. Fontaine's inspiration came from Belle Epoque France and Industrial Revolution Britain, with some Italian references sprinkled in. Snezhnaya, it seems, will embody Imperial and Soviet-era Russia, with some other related Slavic cultures included too. Both nations, then, draw from a roughly similar time period from nations in neighboring regions with notable cultural interchange. Given those connections between the inspiration and the return to their traditional design language, it's inevitable that similarities would crop up. I think it's too early to dismiss the entire region, but for the character design specifically, I can understand why people might feel let down. I'd guess that whether or not this bothers each person will depend on how they felt about Fontaine itself. I personally love that era of fashion, so naturally I'm very happy to get more characters who feel superficially similar, but I can still sympathize with people who wanted something different. I can't help but think it's a shame Hoyo don't allow their English voice actors to use any accent other than American, since that would have been a fantastic way to give the place a different feel, which would perhaps make it easier for some to see beyond the similar aesthetics. We'll just have to hope the world building and the storytelling gives us a distinct sense of place instead. Now, there is another whole perspective which some try to push into these first two discussions, the idea that Genshin itself is fundamentally bland, outdated, and unappealing, and that anyone who claims to like it is blinkered by blind loyalty to Hoyoverse. I find these discussions kinda hilarious, since they show either how little understanding these people have of the art form they're trying to critique, or how desperate they are to drive that rage bait engagement. In many ways, Genshin is outdated, and there's a lot Hoyo needs to improve if they want to catch up to their more modern competition. That's inevitable when you have a successful game which lives a long time, since competitors can come in with fresh new ideas and take advantage of new engines and new techniques. However, a lot of these arguments come from people who simply prefer a different art style to the one Genshin chose, and are conceited enough that they think their perspective is objective truth. Personally, I love different art styles in different games. I get the appeal of realism. I've spent countless hours exploring and taking photos of the world in Horizon and Red Dead Redemption 2, for example. However, I still find Genshin utterly stunning at times. I always wanted a way to step into Studio Ghibli film, and at its best, Genshin's world design can achieve that feeling for me. Something no game which strives for realism can ever hope to match. And that principle applies to the characters as well. People highlight more out there designs in other games, which can make Genshin seem safe in comparison, but that's absolutely personal taste as well. I actually prefer Genshin's more subdued designs and tend to dislike the ones that feel more cluttered. Introducing something completely off the wall would require some skilled world building to make it feel natural to me in the context of Teyvat. And when it comes to the combat animations, this fan edit of Nicole's burst is genius. Obviously, it takes that argument to absurdity, but sometimes exaggeration is the only way to get through to people. Some of us don't want gameplay to be an endless series of flashy cutscenes, and we like it when a character has animations which express their personality, instead of aiming to give people some momentary adrenaline boost or whatever else they get out of it. Genshin's combat is far from flawless, its interface is ridiculously cluttered, and the power creep and shilling in its endgame is a joke. There is a lot of valid criticism to level at the game, and yet you can still tell when the critique comes from people who care, and when it comes from others who just want to imply that Genshin is inferior. And as to whether the designs are good or bad, to really evaluate whether a design is a success, you first need to know what the designer was intending to achieve. Any argument which tries to assert that a character's design is objectively good or bad based on this kind of trailer alone is doomed to fail, because we can't say for sure what the intent was in the first place. We can make a pretty reasonable assumption that each design has a few competing intents behind it. Of course, most importantly, they want to appeal to the target audience so that they can sell the characters in-game. They'll also have other goals as well. The design should express the character's personality in some way, or their backstory, or their place in the world, or their role in the story. They should feel at home within the world in general, and their own nation in particular, and so on. Until we've actually met these characters and experienced their parts in the story, the only one of those we can even start to talk about is the first one. It is the most important, but it's also the most subjective. People have different preferences, and since Genshin aims to target a wide, diverse audience, it's literally impossible to create a character who will appeal to everyone. For one thing, some people are only here for waifus and some are only here for husbandos. You can't please both, so by definition, every character is aimed at a subset of the audience. But that's not to say that any discussion right now is pointless. It's fun to talk about our personal, subjective perspective on each character's design and compare and contrast which ones we like and which ones we dislike, and maybe even talk about why we feel that way. It's fun to hear other people's opinions. It's only when people try to turn it into a war that the whole thing gets tiring. So with that in mind, let's quickly run through my first impressions. Vodyanitsa raises the whole question of whether it's good for a new character to embody the existing design patterns rather than taking a new direction. The silhouette of her dress echoes Columbina's, and she's a very clear example of those design tropes which have always been Genshin's calling card, so many people find her underwhelming. Personally, I adore her design. I like the patterns she evokes, and the detailing and color scheme distinguish her enough from the others like her for me at a glance. The moment I saw her, I knew my meager stash of Primogems would be in trouble in Snezhnaya. Alyosha looks cool, perhaps the one who feels the most at home in a cold, snowy nation. I was generally lukewarm on his design aesthetically, but after seeing he has a puppy, and a husky no less, I absolutely must get him. I also suspect his aesthetic takes more overt inspiration from Slavic cultural traditions than some of the other characters, though since I'm no expert, I could be mistaken here. Odette, in my opinion, is utterly beautiful. While I still love the more typical Genshin silhouette, I appreciate variety as well, and Odette's ballerina styling makes her stand out as something fresh which still fits within the world. It's interesting that the trailer shows her acting as an assassin too. She seems like an interesting character already. I'm expecting her animations to be particularly elegant and fluid, though that doubtless means Hoyo will give her an off-field kit so we never actually get to use them in combat, because that's just how they roll. Valeriy is exactly what I'd always imagined a military commander should look like in Teyvat, and I'm really hoping his character can live up to his fantastic design. I'm particularly curious whether the bear in his combat scene is symbolic or something which will actually play a part in his kit itself. It looks like he'll use the more buff character model they introduced with Vaka. If so, it's great that they're continuing with that, and it gives me hope they might add more variety in the future. Vesna, interestingly, has already become a major point of controversy. She comes across very much as a fairy rather than a commander of the guards, even though that's her stated role, the polar opposite of Valeriy. We'll get to some of the more specific criticisms people have about her shortly, since she's such a clear example of some wider problems people have, but personally, I'm just a sucker for pastel colors and I can't help but love her style. Danica, meanwhile, is the one design out of the lot which I actively dislike. I've seen a few people say they're a bit tired of the maid aesthetic in general, but for me, it's partly that I just do not like her color scheme or her too symmetrical silhouette, and partly that her skirt bothers the part of me which spent so long creating realistic clothes for The Sims. Her skirt is too wide and puffy to be so open at the front, and it looks like there should be a wire petticoat holding it up, yet the shape makes it clear that she isn't wearing one. Not a problem for many people, I'd imagine, but for me, it's like an itch I just can't scratch. I've seen a bunch of people praise her as their favorite design out of the bunch, but she's an instant no for me. Noi, on the other hand, is yet another hit. I'm really hoping they can give him a sense of dangerous mystery, since it would be so fitting for his design, and since the game will need some more antagonistic forces if we continue to get closer to the remaining Harbingers. Based on his design alone, Noi could be a perfect fit. Mitya I like quite a lot as well. His design has a slightly different feel to the others in the trailer, a little more reminiscent of Sumeru than Fontaine. At first glance, he looks like he'd feel right at home in the academia. Even if he's not, I kinda love that archetype, and the flowing fabric of his outfit looks gorgeous. And finally, the Tsaritsa herself. I think it was inevitable that Hoyo were going to disappoint some people here. If they went with something unexpected, like some had vocally wished for, then those who wanted a classic icy maiden would have felt let down. But since we got exactly that, to others, her reveal felt anticlimactic. She's the embodiment of Genshin's expected orthodox style, and as you might expect, I love everything about her design. I'm sure something more unexpected could have been just as great. I still kinda wish she was a chibi just because of the utter chaos that would have caused, but I'm pretty sure she's going to be a must-have for me, especially if her characterization and story lives up to the epic potential hinted at as she stepped forth to confront the shade of death. That all said, let's emphasize once again, whether or not a design is good is entirely subjective, and even if a majority feel the same way about any given character, it's pretty childish for people to go around dunking on anyone who disagrees, though even that is fine as long as it's intended and received as a bit of harmless fun. People shouldn't take this whole thing so seriously. At the end of the day, no matter how much we care about it, it isn't life and death. Personally, I like these designs. There's pros and cons to the lack of variety, and it just happens that Snezhnaya has aesthetics which I'm absolutely biased towards. There are also pros and cons to how much more closely they fit the design guidelines common to the rest of the game. The greater cohesion makes the whole game feel more polished to me personally, so again, the choice they've made this time just happens to align with my preferences. But as always, they're not going to appeal to everyone, and that's why talking about this is fun. Those threads felt like the major ones to me because they're all about Snezhnaya itself and how it relates to the rest of the game. The others, meanwhile, are just the latest rounds in conversations which apply to the entire game in general. The first of these is the whole debate over whether the characters' outfits are appropriate for the climate in which they're supposed to live. Snezhnaya is supposed to be a harsh, icy land, and the glimpses we've seen of it so far are smothered with endless drifts of snow. Several of the characters have outfits which feel fitting for this climate. Thick and heavy, with fur linings and copious obvious layers, they look like they'd keep you warm in a snowstorm. Those characters, coincidentally, are all men. Many others, most of the women in fact, do not have outfits with these same traits. They have revealing dresses, short skirts, tights, and exposed skin. The argument is that these characters are so ill-fitting to the region that it feels like they'd get frostbite the moment they stepped outside, and it just does not make sense. I have a few responses to this. First, I actually lived in a Nordic country for a few years with a climate much like Snezhnaya's. Most of the time in the depths of winter, you just stay inside. When you do venture out, if you're quick and going from building to building, the hassle of putting on countless layers just isn't worth it. A brief chill isn't that big a deal, so you just make sure you're quick. Throw in heated trains for long distance travel, and the character designs are less inappropriate than they might have seemed, especially for those whose position in society does not involve the outside world. Second, the gender balance on that point is a little off. We have a singer, a ballerina, a maid, and a queen. All people who would spend their time indoors, while out of the guys, only Mitya looks like an indoor person. It would have been cool to have a female ranger swathed in furs to match Alyosha and Valeriy, for example, and hopefully we'll get someone along those lines before the region is done. Anyone eagle-eyed might have noticed two characters missing from that list, Noi and Vesna. Both of their outfits feel intended for outdoor wear to me, and yet they look badly suited to extended exposure to the cold. My assumption is that they're descended from the Snowland Fae, and as are all of Vesna's troops, and the Fae are immune to the cold. It's a bit of a cop-out, and it would have been cool if Vesna's military outfit had been more appropriate to the climate, but as long as this is covered somewhere in the world building, it likely won't bother anyone by the time the story's done. In the end, this is yet another subjective thing. Whether or not the characters' outfits feel right within the context of their climate is down to personal interpretation. Many just do not know how easy it is to acclimatize to temperatures which look unbearable to others, so these outfits seem bizarre to them. That perspective is understandable. It's pretty clear that for a lot of people, the story will have to do a lot of work to make it feel natural. A related point of contention, which comes up when people start talking about character designs, is that some are getting very tired of the fact that so many of the female characters wear a dress. There are a fair few who wear tights or leggings or shorts or perhaps a skirt, but since the VAT aesthetic emphasizes layered fabric, those all end up with a similar silhouette to the characters wearing dresses, so the cast feels less varied than it is. As the number of characters slowly builds up over time, this trend becomes even more obvious. Some will say this is because that shape is what sells, but you only have to look at Arlecchino to see that a woman wearing trousers could be just as popular. She basically wears a suit, covered from head to toe, and yet people love her design. The fact that it's her who bucks this trend makes me wonder if that's at least in part deliberate. It makes her stand out from the crowd, and it emphasizes the key to her character, that she defies expectations every step along the way. It even echoes her title as father. But even if it would diminish how well her design expresses this aspect of her character, I would love some more designs like hers, and I think they'd be a big success. Hoyo can do whatever they want with their world building and could simply state that clothing in Tevat is strongly gendered and therefore it's set in stone that almost all women wear dresses. Even if there is some justification, this is one place where, for me at least, they do well to at least lighten their restrictions. And as always, there's discourse about the gender ratio in the game. This time around, there's quite an even balance, with 4 of the 9 new characters being male. One thing I find bizarre about this part is just how many people fail to comprehend that anyone would pull for a character they're not attracted to. I guess the only reason they pull is the goon. I can't relate even a little bit. The most important thing for me is whether I like their personality and story. Second is whether I find their gameplay fun, and whether their design is visually appealing is a distant third. And to be clear, visual appeal means aesthetics and style. Attraction does not come into it at all. Maybe it's just a niche I happen to experience, but pretty much everyone I've talked to about this is the same. Anyone who starts from the assumption that people pull for characters they're attracted to is just flat out wrong for at least this part of the community. It always reminds me of how so many are adamant that basically every character is romantically connected to the traveler, when I've always felt that Hoyo left these interactions deliberately ambiguous. To me, they generally came across as friendships rather than even hints at romantic interest, including the ones which people think are more blatant than others. And that's regardless of the traveler's gender. I have an account with each. For example, Ayaka came across as a friend in my reading of their interactions. She just has an anxious attachment style and cherishes our friendship because she doesn't have other friends. To me, she sees it as a close and intimate companionship, but that doesn't have to equate to romance. Columbina is similar. She looks to the traveler not because we have the closest friendship, friendship with her or the most history, but because we were the one who had the patience to discover how she perceived the world and help her build a bridge of understanding so she could finally connect with the others she's even closer to. I see nothing wrong in people adding headcanon around any of these relationships, which tips them into romance, and I'm pretty sure that's one of the reasons Hoyo leave it at least a little ambiguous, but there are at least 2 exceptions to their usual approach, which embody how I have always expected things to come across for a character who had canon romantic interest in the Traveler. First, Jet, who has special interactions for Lumine specifically, which show greater hints that she's romantically interested. And second, Sitlali, who is so obviously down bad for the Traveler that it's a legitimate plot point which comes up every time she's present in a story. Those interactions showcase what I'd expect for an actual canon romantic interest. What we get outside of those 2 is ambiguity and hints, and it's left deliberately open so each individual can decide whether something deeper is going on. And that's kind of my whole perspective when it comes to character designs, variety, silhouette, and even whether clothes are appropriate to the climate. It's subjective. Ambiguity isn't always a flaw to be resolved, and there is no correct answer to the vast majority of the discussions about the game. This one feels more fraught than most because Hoyo's past decisions set up conflicting promises. Different sections of the community felt drawn to different ones, which inevitably led to disappointment. I loved almost every character in that trailer, in part because it paid off the promises I personally cared about. I still think the people on the other side have a valid point. Until next time.